The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. General William Hartley stood in his office at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Paris, September 1944. Outside, church bells rang. People danced in the streets. France was liberated. The Nazi war machine was crumbling. Victory tasted sweet on every tongue but his. He held the thin paper between his thumb and forefinger, reading the words for the third time, though he'd memorized them after the first. Regret to inform you. Captain James Hartley, killed in action, September 8, 1944. Hürtgen Forest, his son. 23 years old, dead in a forest whose name Hartley himself had circled on a map 6 weeks ago, authorizing the offensive that would send thousands of young men into those dark, endless trees. The bells outside continued their celebration. Somewhere below his window, a soldier kissed a French girl. Champagne bottles popped like distant gunfire. The world was drunk on hope. Hartley carefully folded the telegram and placed it in his breast pocket, directly over his heart. His hand didn't shake. His face didn't crack. 40 years of military discipline had taught him that much. How to keep the war outside from getting inside. But now the war was inside, burning through his chest like shrapnel he couldn't extract. He walked to the window and looked down at the celebration. How many of those dancing soldiers had he sent to their deaths? How many telegrams like his had been delivered to kitchen tables across America, England, Canada, Australia? How many mothers had collapsed reading those same terrible words? And how many of those orders had he signed without a tremor in his hand, without a catch in his throat, because that's what generals do? Generals make calculations. They trade lives for objectives. They draw lines on maps and call it strategy. The door opened behind him. "Sir, they're waiting for you in the war room." Major Collins, his aide, young and eager, untouched by the kind of loss that makes a man old overnight. "I'll be there in a moment," Hartley said, his voice steady as granite. "Of course, sir." "And, sir?" Collins hesitated. "Congratulations on the liberation. Your strategies were brilliant. Brilliant." The word echoed in Hartley's skull as Collins left. He'd been called brilliant before, at West Point, where he graduated top of his class. At the War College, where his papers on mechanized warfare had impressed Eisenhower himself. In North Africa, where his tank divisions had outmaneuvered Rommel's Africa Corps. Brilliant at the chess game of death. Brilliant at moving pieces across boards while boys bled into foreign soil. James had wanted to be a teacher. He'd studied literature at Harvard, wrote poetry in the margins of his textbooks. But when Pearl Harbor burned, he'd enlisted anyway, because that's what Hartley men did. 3 generations of soldiers. 3 generations of service and sacrifice. "I'm proud of you, son," Hartley had told him at the train station in 1942. James in his new lieutenant's uniform, looking impossibly young. "I'll make you proud, Dad," James had said, smiling that crooked smile he'd inherited from his mother. "I'll make you proud." The last words his son ever spoke to him. Hartley pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window. Down below, the celebration continued. They didn't know, couldn't know, that every victory was built on a foundation of graves. That every mile gained was measured in letters that began with, "We regret to inform you." That generals didn't win wars. They just decided which sons would die for the winning. He thought about the war room waiting for him. The maps spread across the table. The colored pins representing divisions and regiments. Somewhere on one of those maps was another forest, another town, another river crossing that would require another authorization, another signature, another calculated sacrifice, and he would give it, because that's what generals do, even when their own sons are among the calculated dead, even when victory tastes like ash, even when the only thing they want to do is fall to their knees and scream at a god, who seems to have abandoned this blood-soaked world, but he wouldn't scream, he wouldn't fall. He would walk into that war room with his shoulders straight and his face like stone, and he would make more decisions that would fill more graves, because the alternative was surrender, and surrender meant that James and all the others had died for nothing. The telegram crinkled in his pocket as he turned from the window. Outside, Paris celebrated liberation. Inside, General William Hartley prepared to send more sons to die. The war room smelled of cigarette smoke and stale coffee. Maps covered every wall, Europe carved into grids and coordinates, rivers marked in blue, cities in red, enemy positions in black. 6 senior officers stood around the central table waiting for him. "Gentlemen," Hartley said, stepping inside. They snapped to attention. He waved them down. "Berlin won't take itself," he continued. his voice carrying the authority that had commanded divisions across 2 continents. Let's begin. For the next 3 hours, they discussed logistics. The British wanted to advance through the Netherlands. The Americans favored a broad front approach. Patton was screaming for more fuel. Montgomery was demanding more troops. The Russians were racing from the east, hungry to reach Berlin first. And somewhere in all of this strategic choreography, thousands more young men would die in ways their mothers couldn't imagine. Hartley listened to the arguments, studied the maps, made decisions with the cold precision that had earned him his stars. Not once did he mention the telegram in his pocket. Not once did his voice waver. But his mind kept drifting to a different map, the one he'd studied 25 years ago, in 1919, when he was a young captain returning from the trenches of the Great War. They'd called it the war to end all wars. What a bitter joke that had turned out to be. He'd met James's mother that year, Eleanor Hartley, née Morrison, a nurse who'd seen too much death in field hospitals near Verdun. They'd married quietly, both of them trying to forget what they'd witnessed, trying to build something clean and good from the wreckage of the old world. James was born in 1921, a child of the peace, inheritor of their desperate hope that never again would fathers send sons to die in foreign mud. General? Sir? Collins was speaking to him. The room had gone quiet. I apologize. Repeat that last point. The Hürtgen Forest offensive, sir. Colonel Bradley is requesting additional artillery support. The casualties have been significant. The words hit like bullets. Hürtgen Forest, where his son had died 5 days ago, while Hartley was probably sitting in this same room, drinking the same stale coffee, moving colored pins across maps, calculating acceptable loss ratios. How significant? Hartley heard himself ask. Bradley consulted his notes. 24,000 casualties over the past 6 weeks, sir. The terrain is difficult. Dense forest, limited visibility, entrenched German positions. Some companies have lost 80% of their strength. 80%. Mathematical language for slaughter. Clinical terms for boys blown apart by mortars, or dying slowly from gut wounds in the dark between the trees, calling for mothers who would never hear them. Increase the artillery, Hartley ordered, and authorize 2 additional infantry divisions. We need that forest cleared before winter. Yes, sir. More pins pushed into the map. More sons allocated to death. All in service of the great grinding machine that would eventually, inevitably, crush Germany into submission. When the meeting ended, Hartley remained alone in the war room. He walked to the map of Germany and found Hürtgen Forest, a small green area on the Belgian-German border. Such a tiny space to contain so much death. His finger traced the roads and trails that James must have walked, the clearings where he might have rested, the exact coordinates where some German shell or bullet had ended 23 years of life in a fraction of a second. I'm sorry, he whispered to the map. But sorry changed nothing. Sorry didn't raise the dead or comfort the grieving. Sorry was just another word that meant nothing in the calculus of war. He thought of Eleanor, back home in Virginia, who didn't know yet that she was a mother in past tense. The telegram would arrive tomorrow, delivered by some solemn-faced officer who would use the same useless words. He died bravely. He served with honor. His sacrifice will not be forgotten. All lies, kindly meant but lies nonetheless. James hadn't died bravely. He'd died terrified and in agony, probably calling out for help that never came. He hadn't served with honor. He'd served because honor demanded it, because his father was a general and Hartley men didn't shirk duty, no matter how much they wanted to. And his sacrifice would be forgotten within a generation, buried under the weight of 50 million other deaths, another name on a memorial wall that people would walk past without reading. Hartley pulled out the telegram again, unfolded it, read it once more in the dim light of the war room. The words hadn't changed. His son was still dead. Victory was still coming, and he was still the man who would lead them there, one calculated death at a time, because someone had to do the mathematics of mourning, and generals were trained to count bodies without flinching. He refolded the telegram and placed it back in his pocket. Tomorrow, he would write to Eleanor. Tomorrow, he would find words for the unspeakable. Tomorrow, he would be the grieving father. But tonight, he was still General William Hartley, and there was a war to win, even if winning felt like drowning. The letter to Eleanor took 6 hours to write. Hartley sat at his desk long after midnight, the Paris streets finally quiet, the celebration exhausted into sleep. He went through 4 drafts, each one insufficient, each one failing to capture the specific weight of their loss. Dearest Eleanor, by now you will have received the telegram about James. I wish I could be there with you. I wish I could hold you as we face this together. But I am here, and you are there. And the ocean between us feels wider than any distance I've ever known." He paused, pen hovering over paper. What could he possibly say that would matter? What words existed for this? "Our son died well. That's what they tell me." He led his men through enemy fire to secure a position on Hill 232. When a German machine gun nest threatened to destroy his entire platoon, he volunteered for the assault. He saved 23 men before the end came. Hero, that's what they're calling him. They want to recommend him for the Medal of Honor. But I keep thinking about how he wanted to teach English literature. Do you remember? He was going to return to Harvard after the war, get his doctorate, spend his life helping young people discover Shakespeare and Keats. He had already been accepted into the graduate program. The letter came last month. I was going to surprise him with it when we next spoke. He'll never read that letter now. Hartley set down the pen. His eyes burned, but no tears came. He'd learned too well how to contain grief, how to compartmentalize pain into neat boxes that could be stored away and forgotten. But James wouldn't fit in a box. James was everywhere. In the photographs on his desk, in the memories of teaching him to fish, in the ghost of that crooked smile. He picked up one of the photographs. James at age 7, missing his front teeth, holding up a trout he'd caught at their cabin in Montana. That had been 1928, before the Depression, before the world started its slow slide toward another war. James had been so proud of that fish. They'd cooked it over an open fire and talked about constellations while the Montana sky turned infinite with stars. "I want to explore the world, Dad," James had said that night. "I want to see everything and know everything and maybe write books about it all." "You will, son," Hartley had promised. "You'll do extraordinary things." Another photograph. James in his Harvard graduation gown, 1942, standing between his parents. 3 weeks later, he'd enlisted. 3 weeks after that, he was gone to basic training, 2 years and 4 months from graduation to grave. Hartley returned to the letter. "I keep asking myself if I could have stopped this. If I had ordered him to accept a staff position here in Paris, away from the front. If I had used my rank to keep him safe. Other generals do it, I know they do. They pull strings to protect their sons while sending everyone else's boys into the fire. But James wouldn't have wanted that. He had your integrity, Eleanor, your moral clarity. He would have seen it as cowardice, as betrayal of the men who didn't have generals for fathers. He would have hated me for it, so I let him go. I let him lead from the front, let him face the same dangers as every other soldier. And now he's dead, and I tell myself I made the honorable choice. But honor is cold comfort tonight." A knock at the door interrupted him. "Enter." Collins stepped inside, looking exhausted. "Sir, I'm sorry to disturb you. There's a situation developing in Holland. Field Marshal Montgomery is requesting—" "It can wait until morning," Hartley said. Collins hesitated, clearly surprised. General Hartley never postponed military matters. General Hartley was the man who worked while others slept, who made decisions while lesser officers sought rest. "Of course, sir. I'll brief you at 0600. "Collins," Hartley called as the major turned to leave. "Do you have family?" "Sir? Yes, sir. A younger brother. He's 17. Keep him out of this war," Hartley said. "Whatever it takes." Collins looked confused, but nodded. "Yes, sir. Good night, sir." When he was alone again, Hartley finished the letter. "I don't know how to be a general anymore, Eleanor. Every order I give now, I see James's face. Every strategy I authorize, I imagine him dying because of it. They tell me we'll win this war by next summer. They tell me Germany is collapsing. They tell me the sacrifice has meaning. But I look at that telegram and all I see is waste. Not noble sacrifice, not heroic duty, just waste. Our beautiful boy who loved poetry and fishing and making you laugh, reduced to a line in a casualty report. I'm trying to be strong. I'm trying to honor his memory by finishing what he started. But tonight, I'm just a father who would trade every star on my shoulder to hear his voice one more time. I love you. I'm sorry. I'm so desperately sorry. William, he sealed the letter and placed it in the outgoing mail basket. Somewhere across the Atlantic, Eleanor would read those words and know that she wasn't alone in her grief. It wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough. But it was all he had to give. Dawn was breaking over Paris. The city was waking to another day of liberation, another day of joy purchased with blood. Hartley stood and straightened his uniform, composed his face into the mask of command that generals wore. There were briefings to attend, strategies to refine, more pins to push into maps, more sons to send toward their graves. The war demanded it, victory required it, and General William Hartley would deliver it, because that's what he'd been trained to do. even as it killed him inside, one decision at a time. November 1944, Belgium. The Hürtgen Forest stretched dark and silent under winter skies. Intelligence reports suggested German weakness, a broken enemy retreating toward the fatherland. Allied forces spread thin across 100 miles of front, preparing for the final push into Germany. Hartley stood in a forward command post near Bastogne, reviewing defensive positions with his staff. The frontline soldiers were exhausted. Months of continuous combat had ground them down to shadows of the men who'd landed at Normandy. But the end was near. Everyone said so. One more winter, one more offensive, and the nightmare would finally end. "Sir, we're getting scattered reports of increased German activity," Major Collins said, pointing to the map. "Nothing confirmed, but some patrol units are reporting tank movements in the forest." "Probably remnants retreating east," Colonel Bradley suggested. "The Wehrmacht is finished." Hartley studied the map, that old instinct prickling at the back of his mind, the one that had kept him alive through 4 years of war, the one that smelled danger before it arrived. "Double the reconnaissance patrols," he ordered, "and place the reserves on alert. Sir, with respect, that will delay our preparations for the spring offensive," Bradley protested. "Do it anyway." 3 days later, hell came to the Ardennes. German tanks emerged from the forest by the hundreds. Panthers, Tigers, mobile artillery, supported by 3 entire armies that intelligence had somehow missed. It was Hitler's last desperate gamble. A massive offensive aimed at splitting the Allied forces and recapturing Antwerp. The attack hit exactly where Hartley's forces were weakest. Within hours, American positions were overrun. Units were surrounded, cut off, destroyed. Radio traffic dissolved into chaos. Calls for help, for ammunition, for medical evacuation that couldn't come because German armor controlled the roads. Hartley stood in the command post, listening to the catastrophe unfold in real time, making decisions that determined who would be rescued and who would be abandoned, which units would receive reinforcements, and which would be left to die, buying time for others to escape. It was everything he'd been trained for. The ultimate test of generalship, staying calm while the world burned, making impossible choices with incomplete information, trading lives against objectives with the cold precision of a surgeon cutting away diseased flesh. But he kept seeing James's face in every radio report. "Sir, the 101st Airborne is surrounded at Bastogne. They're requesting permission to withdraw. Captain James Hartley, killed in action. Tell them to hold. Reinforcements are coming. Sir, the 106th Division is being overrun on the Schnee Eifel. They have no ammunition and no escape route. 23 years old. Order them to hold as long as possible, then surrender if necessary. Sir, General McAuliffe needs authorization to..." He wanted to teach English literature. Authorized. Next. Hour after hour. Decision after decision. Each one sending men to die or survive based on calculations that felt increasingly arbitrary. What made one unit worth saving over another? What algorithm determined that the 101st Airborne deserved reinforcement while the 106th Division was expendable? What gave him the right to play God with thousands of lives? He'd been making these calculations for years without hesitation. But now, with James's ghost standing at his shoulder, every decision felt like murder. The Battle of the Bulge, they would later call it. The largest battle on the Western Front, the bloodiest American engagement of the war. 19,000 killed, 90,000 total casualties over 6 weeks of brutal winter combat. Hartley commanded through all of it. He moved divisions, authorized counterattacks, coordinated with Patton's relief force, stabilized collapsing positions, turned near disaster into eventual victory. His leadership during those dark weeks would be studied at military academies for generations. But every night, alone in his quarters, he counted the cost in ways that would never appear in history books. 19,000 dead. 19,000 telegrams sent to 19,000 homes. 19,000 mothers and fathers experiencing what he'd experienced in September. 19,000 futures erased. 19,000 young men who'd wanted to be teachers, or farmers, or fathers, or poets, all reduced to casualty statistics, all sacrificed on the altar of necessary victory. And he had authorized it all. Not alone. There were dozens of generals, hundreds of colonels, thousands of officers making similar calculations. But Hartley bore command responsibility for this sector. These deaths were his to carry. On Christmas Eve, with the battle still raging, Hartley wrote in his private journal, the one Eleanor would find after his death decades later. "They gave me stars for being good at killing. The better I became at calculating death, the higher they promoted me. I can look at a map and tell you exactly how many men will die taking that hill, crossing that river. holding that bridge. I can make those calculations without trembling, without weeping, without vomiting from the horror of what I'm doing. They call this leadership. They call this courage. They call this necessary. But James is still dead, and I put him there. Not personally. I didn't give the order that sent him to Hürtgen Forest. But I built the machine that consumed him. I perfected the mathematics of murder. I trained an entire generation to make the same cold calculations I make every day. And when this war ends, they'll give me more medals and tell me I'm a hero. But heroes don't weep alone in dark rooms, haunted by the faces of boys they've sent to die. The liberation of Bastogne came in late December. Patton's tanks broke through the German encirclement. The Wehrmacht's offensive collapsed. By January, the crisis was over. The front stabilized. The march toward Germany resumed. Victory was coming. Everyone could taste it now. Everyone except the generals who knew its true price. Today on the show, we're diving into the world of economic indicators. These are the numbers that tell us how the economy is doing. Things like GDP, unemployment rates, and consumer confidence. But what do these indicators really mean? How are they calculated? And how should we interpret them? We'll break it all down for you with the help of some experts to make sense of the numbers that shape our world. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. Germany surrendered unconditionally. After 6 years of war that had consumed 50 million lives, peace finally came to a devastated continent. General William Hartley stood in the same Paris office where he'd received the telegram about James 9 months earlier. Outside, the celebration was even larger than September's liberation. A desperate, ecstatic release of years of accumulated terror and grief. On his desk lay the orders for his return to the United States. His service in Europe was complete. The War Department wanted him in Washington, planning for the inevitable conflict with Japan, preparing for the next set of calculations, the next maps, the next pins representing sons who would die for objectives yet to be determined. But Hartley had already submitted his resignation. He was 53 years old. He'd spent 32 years in uniform, fought in 2 world wars, risen from second lieutenant to major general. He'd commanded thousands of men, authorized operations that shaped the course of history, earned enough medals to cover his chest twice over, and all he wanted now was to stop. Before leaving Paris, he made one final journey. The American cemetery at Normandy stretched, white and endless across the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. 9,000 crosses and stars of David marked the resting places of boys who died in the first hours of liberation. More cemeteries were being established across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Holland. Vast gardens of the dead, geometric proof of war's true cost. But James wasn't here. James was buried in a temporary cemetery near Hürtgen Forest, awaiting eventual repatriation. Hartley had requested that his son be returned to Virginia, to the family plot where Hartleys had been buried for 4 generations. Still, he needed to walk among these graves, needed to see what his victories had purchased. The crosses stretched in perfect rows as far as he could see, each one identical, each one representing a universe of loss. Parents who would never hold grandchildren, wives who would grow old alone, children who would forget their fathers' faces, futures erased, dreams destroyed, all the accumulated might-have-beens of 90,000 young men buried in French soil. Hartley walked slowly between the rows, reading names when he could. Private John Morrison, age 19, Kansas. Corporal Michael Chen, age 21, California. Lieutenant Robert Washington, age 24. Georgia, Sergeant Thomas O'Brien, age 20, Massachusetts. Each name a James, each grave a telegram, each cross a father's grief, a mother's shattered heart. He found himself kneeling in the grass between the rows, finally alone, finally beyond the reach of duty and rank and the expectations of command. His shoulders shook. Tears came at last. 9 months of suppressed grief finally breaking through the dam of discipline. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the dead. "I'm so sorry. Sorry for James. Sorry for all of them. Sorry for being good at the mathematics of murder, for perfecting the calculus of necessary death, for learning how to send boys to die without trembling. They would build monuments to this war. They would write histories celebrating the courage and sacrifice. They would tell stories of heroes and honor and the great crusade against evil. All of it true, in its way. But they would never capture this truth. That every victory was also a defeat. That every liberation was also a funeral. That the men who won wars were also the men who couldn't live with winning. An hour passed. Maybe more. The sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows between the white crosses. Finally, Hartley stood, wiping his face, composing himself one last time. He would return to Virginia. He would hold Eleanor and grieve with her properly. He would tend James's grave and try to find meaning in the wreckage of their hopes. He would live out his remaining years trying to forget the war while knowing he never could, because generals didn't get to forget. Generals carried the dead forever. As he walked back toward the cemetery entrance, he passed a young French woman placing flowers on a grave. She looked up at him, saw his stars, and spoke in careful English. "Thank you, General, for our freedom." Hartley wanted to tell her that freedom wasn't free, the cliché that everyone mouthed without understanding its weight. He wanted to tell her that her freedom had cost him his son and cost 90,000 other families their sons, and that he would trade every inch of liberated Europe to have James back for just one more day. But he didn't. He simply nodded and continued walking, because that's what generals did. They carried the burden silently. They made the terrible calculations so others didn't have to. They wept alone so the world could celebrate victory in Europe. The war was over. But General William Hartley knew a truth that wouldn't make the history books. For the men who made the decisions, who gave the orders, who counted the cost in telegrams and graves and shattered families, the war would never really end. It would live in them forever, a weight that grew heavier with every year. Every memory, every moment they closed their eyes and saw the faces of the boys they'd sent to die. He reached his car and looked back once, more at the endless rows of white crosses, standing silent witness to what victory truly meant. Then, he drove away, toward home, toward Eleanor, toward whatever peace an old general could find while carrying the ghosts of 90,000 sons. Behind him, the crosses stood in their perfect rows, gleaming white against the French soil, marking the price of freedom that no one could ever fully pay. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you felt the weight that these men carried, share it with someone who needs to understand what leadership truly costs. Let us never forget that behind every strategic victory were fathers who sent sons to die and lived with that knowledge every day thereafter. Their burden was victory. Their price was silence. Their legacy is the freedom we inherit and too often take for granted. Remember them, honor them, and pray we never again ask fathers to make such calculations.